Hello and welcome to the third section of the America module. So the third section is all about the Civil War and its aftermath and how it affected different groups in American society, particularly with a focus on African American people and their role in the Civil War. So the Civil War lasts between 1861 and 1865, resulting in 750,000 deaths. So you can see on the map there, the countries in blue are the ones that stay in the Union, stay loyal to the President Lincoln. The ones in red are the states that break away from the Union and form the Confederacy. The states that are those border states there in the middle, places like Missouri and Kentucky in red and blue, they are states that don't break away, although slavery is legal in those states. So what caused the Civil War then? So one of the biggest factors is the differences in life between the North and the South. People in the South saw the cities and the industry in the North of America as too modern and against their way of life, a threat to their way of life. So there's the growth of factories and large cities in the North compared to the South being much more of an agricultural and rural economy, obviously based on slavery. The populations of those northern states is also growing rapidly, and obviously with the American political system the way it is, the bigger the population in a state, the more votes it has in a presidential election. So people in the South are worried about this growing population in the North that could hand the North or the northern states more power than them. As a result, we get in 1850 something called the Clay Compromise. It's a law that states that the North has to return escaped slaves back to their holders in the South. In return for this, California is allowed to become a free state. So California on the far left of the map, the one with the number 4 in it in red, joins the Union as a free state. That's the kind of trade-off. We then get something called the Kansas-Nebraska Act in 1854. That said that states could decide for themselves if they wanted to be slave states or free states. This is significant because it overturns the Missouri Compromise from 1820, which had said one slave state and one free state, added at a time, so states added in pairs. This now puts the decision in the hands of states, and they can decide for themselves. In 1857, the Supreme Court rules that slaves have no rights and slavery cannot be banned. So this strengthens the southern states, the slaveholding states. You also get a growth in the abolitionist movement, so people such as Frederick Douglass gaining huge followings, being really listened to in their ideas about ending slavery, talking about how slavery is ungodly, inhumane, incompatible with American life. Furthermore, you get the creation of the Republican Party in 1854, made up of people who are very sort of hostile towards slavery and the slave holding, and this culminates in the election of President Abraham Lincoln in 1860, who's no great fan of slavery. You can see on the map as well the divide that there is in America. The states that are in red are the states that vote for Abraham Lincoln. The states that are in the light blue are the ones who vote for the Democrats, who at this time are very pro-slavery. So you can see America is pretty much divided there on the same lines as the Civil War was fought. So just before the Civil War begins, or the year before the Civil War begins, you can see how divided America is. Final factor is a slave revolt in 1859 led by an escaped slave called John Brown. This makes lots of southern slaveholders very nervous about abolition and moves towards freeing slaves. They're concerned about what's going to happen if that goes ahead. So the start of the Civil War then, as I've just said, almost all of Abraham Lincoln's support comes from the North. And partly as a consequence, in November 1860, South Carolina votes to leave the Union. 6 states follow their lead. These 7 states now elect their own president, a man called Jefferson Davis. Lincoln calls this illegal and says that he will stand up against this and will reunite all of these states into the Union. In response to this, Davis orders some of his troops to open fire on a Union fort. So this is the thing that actually causes the start of the war. So Lincoln declares war and 4 more states break away. So the next thing we need to think about is how people experience the Civil War, in particularly African American people. So in 1861, when the war breaks out, they've got some rights in the northern states, but they are very, very limited. By no means is life in the northern states easy for African American people. It's not. However, it is favourable when you compare it to life in the South, where these people have absolutely no rights at all and are overwhelmingly slaves. There is positive change in the South during the Civil War. In areas that are taken over by the Union Army, slavery comes to an end. There's something called the Sea Islands Experiment, where islands off the coast of America are used to give lands to free slaves. It also starts to set up schools and training programs for them led by Christian missionaries. Despite this, though, the Union refuses to commit to complete abolition at this point when the Civil War begins, and there remains quite rampant racism in the Union Army. At first, African American soldiers aren't allowed to even join. In 1863, Abraham Lincoln announces the Emancipation Proclamation. This makes all slaves in the Confederate States free. Off the back of this, there's a massive increase in African American people joining the Union Army to fight now to end slavery. They've now got that commitment. Many ex-slaves are also given land in the South, and volunteers on the mainland also begin to teach people to read and write. The downside, though, is that many people continue to work on cotton plantations for very, very low wages, and soldiers, as I say, experience that kind of racism and discrimination in the Union Army. If you think about life in the North during this time, so when the Civil War breaks out, African American men can't join the army, and Lincoln at first even considers this plan to essentially remove African American people from America, and there's serious thought given to some kind of plan to remove black people and take them back to Africa. There's also race riots in the North, as many African American men are joining or going into the workforce there, and often at a lower wage than their white compatriots. So there's a lot of hostility towards them, there's a lot of resentment to them. There's also a lot of people in the North who feel that they are fighting a war in order to free African American people, which for some people they don't think is something they should be doing or the North should be doing. 1863, men can now become soldiers in the Union Army, but not officers, and there's lower pay for them. Equal pay is eventually granted in 1864. So the war ends then with the 13th Amendment, the Freedmen's Bureau, and the question of citizenship. So these are all things that Lincoln is coming up with as the war ends, just before he's assassinated. So the 13th Amendment is the Emancipation Proclamation put into law. So it is saying that slavery is unconstitutional, is illegal in America. Lincoln also sets up the Freedmen's Bureau, a charity to help ex-slaves. This gives out land to former slaves. It also sets up schools, like the one you can see in the picture. Lincoln also starts thinking very carefully about how he can potentially afford citizenship to African American people, how he can make them equal citizens in America. Lincoln is assassinated in 1865 and he's replaced by Andrew Johnson, the vice president. Johnson's very much focused on reuniting the country after slavery, so he kind of just wants to almost ignore the tensions and almost pretend that the Civil War didn't happen. Some examples of the things Johnson does during this period of what's called presidential reconstruction, so rebuilding America after the Civil War. Johnson closes the Freedmen's Bureau down. He allows the Confederate states to rejoin the Union and set up their own state governments again. There are things called the Black Codes, which kind of remove rights from African American people and kind of lock racism into the law. He pardons the vast majority of Confederate soldiers, so they never were punished for what they did. He returns land from slaves back to the slave owners, and we also get the emergence of the Ku Klux Klan in this time, and Johnson does very little to discourage that or stop that from happening. Reconstruction then moves on to this next phase, something called radical Reconstruction. Most Republicans are furious with Johnson. Most of them are anti-slavery. Most of them are appalled about the treatment of African American people in the southern states. So they re-establish the Freedmen's Bureau. The Civil Rights Bill is passed in 1866, which puts into law rules protecting African American people's rights. We then get the 14th and 15th Amendments. The 14th Amendment, which says that anyone born in the USA should be a US citizen, regardless of their skin colour. And the 15th Amendment, which was put into law in 1870, that says all African Americans have the right to vote. Also, former Confederate governments are taken over by the North, and soldiers are sent in to essentially protect these rights now that have just been given to African Americans. So this period of radical Reconstruction is a real kind of positive period of change for African American people. By 1870, there's also 2,000 elected politicians. You can see in the picture there the first African American senator elected. So Reconstruction, though, comes to an end, mainly because it angers so many people in the South. Many Northerners bought up cheap land and won expensive development contracts, so things like building the railways in the South. This angers lots of people in the South who think that people from the North are just coming in now and making money out of the South. They're taking all of the best sort of things out of the South, the land, and the big money, the big business out of it. These people become known as carpetbaggers, so people who arrive from the North and take things from the South during the Civil War, just after the Civil War. The Freedmen's Bureau is closed in 1872 again. The Supreme Court also makes a couple of rulings that help bring Reconstruction to an end. 1873, it says that states can decide whether or not to give people the right to vote in state elections. They can't ban them from voting in presidential elections, but in state elections they could. And in 1875, they stated it's not the Supreme Court's job to protect African American voters. So African American voters were often threatened and intimidated and bullied into not voting, and the Supreme Court says there's nothing we can do to protect those rights. 1877, US troops are removed as well from the South, so this protection which was there goes. And finally, most African Americans remain as sharecroppers, so life hasn't really improved. They're reliant on low wages, growing products, growing crops, and selling them. So there's not really any opportunity for most African American people to really build a better life for themselves. Okay, thank you for listening.